Welcome to Study Session. I'm your host, the Data Lord. I'm going to be studying through the Microsoft MS-500. It focuses on security specifically in Microsoft's, Microsoft 365 cloud environment. So I do this stuff all the time. I'm just trying to formalize what I know, and I figure I might as well bring everyone else along the journey if it helps you study for the exam and help you make your environments more secure. Cool. So the first bit we're going over is implement and manage identity and access. Okay. This is daily bread. This is stuff you're going to be doing all the time because the majority of what a company needs is, hey, can you give Johnny access to this application? He's new. That's really, really common. Like, you're going to be doing identity and access constantly. So it's ideal to understand exactly how to implement it correctly and according to best practices, right? So the first question we're really going to answer is like in a scenario where, let's say we have like Azure AD Connect installed on our on-premise server. How do we handle hybrid identity? If we have identities both on-prem and in the cloud. And if you're new, on-prem means on-premises. It just means like on your company's local servers in like your, Salt Lake City data center or whatever it is, your Denver data center. And cloud is obviously all over the place. It's distributed systems. So they're multi-geo or multi-region. And so when you have these two different systems, you have to get them to talk, right? So to tie them together in a Microsoft environment, you use a tool called Azure AD Connect. And before Azure AD Connect was in production, we had a tool called DirSync, or directory synchronization. That tool sucked. It corrupted a lot, and it wasn't very smart. And we learned a lot of things from that DirSync tool, and that's why we have Azure AD Connect now. And Azure AD Connect gives us a lot of other features that we're going to be going over. So, to equip everyone with an understanding of how hybrid identity works, because there's a few different ways we can configure it. That's what we're going to be reading over right now. And so if you'll look with me, we have this white paper. Now, if you're going to be getting into preparing for exams and even just becoming well-versed in IT in general, you're going to need to get really comfortable just referring to the documentation. And a official document with technical specifications is called a white paper. It refers to like technical data sheets that used to be white. A lot of times they are just like a sheet of white paper with, a lot of text on it. And so that's where the term comes from. But just understand it's like read the manual, right? That's the idea. So here we are at learn.microsoft.com under Azure Active Directory, hybrid identity. Up here you see the breadcrumbs. So let's go ahead and read this together. So what is hybrid identity with Azure Active Directory? Today, business and corporations are becoming more and more a mixture of on-premise and cloud applications. Users require access to those applications both on-premises and in the cloud. Managing users both on-premises and in the cloud poses challenging scenarios. Microsoft's identity solutions span on-premise and cloud-based capabilities. These solutions create a common user identity for authentication and authorization to all resources, regardless of location. We call this hybrid identity. So before I keep going, that's the whole idea here, right? Hybrid identity means that the user exists in an on-prem state and in a cloud state, right? And we have solutions that create a common user identity. So it's not like, hey, we have this orphaned account on-prem and this orphaned account in the cloud, and they don't really talk to each other. Just a person has to log in with a lot of different usernames and passwords. This ties those together, so you just have a single source of truth for your identities in hybrid identity. So with hybrid identity to Azure AD and hybrid identity management, these scenarios become possible. To achieve hybrid identity with Azure AD, one of 3 authentication methods can be used, depending on your scenarios. These 3 methods are 1, password hash sync, or PHS, 2, pass-through authentication, or PTA, and 3, federation, which is ADFS. And I can tell you right now, the majority of companies that I see are running password hash sync. And the reason is it's fast, it's modern, it gives some benefits like it can tell you if your passwords have been leaked onto the dark web, for example. So it's really sophisticated and it's secure, as opposed to pass-through authentication is something that you'd only have if you needed it, because you had very tight security specifications. And Federation ADFS is something a lot of companies that have had really big environments for a long time now. Federation with ADFS is how environments tied things together. Let's say you acquired a smaller company and you brought them into your company as an acquisition. You would use Federation ADFS to tie those 2 together so that you could have the parent company and the child company kind of talk to each other, just for example. So ADFS is kind of an old hat. A lot of companies still have it, but a lot of companies are kind of looking at how to get things migrated away from ADFS and towards these like lightweight cloud solutions that don't paint you into a corner with how your on-prem is set up. So let's keep reading. These authentication methods also provide single sign-on capabilities. Single sign-on automatically signs your users in when they are on their corporate devices connected to your corporate network. So single sign-on simply means you sign into Windows, for example, and because you're signed into Windows as your user@company.com email address, that identity has already been authenticated that you are the person who knows that password and knows that account. And typically you're already on a managed device the company issued you. So that's 2 factors of authentication. That's something the password, and something you have, the company issued computer. And so if someone were to phish your password, they wouldn't have something you have, right? And so that's why you have an authentication leg up over a person who might have phished your password. Because if they phished your password, they just have 1 factor of authentication. But since you have the company issued computer, it's something you have specific. That's 2 things which gives the company a high degree of certainty you are the right person and should be granted access in. And if someone has 1 factor of authentication, they should be rejected. That's a really good pattern to have set up. So yeah, that's what single sign-on will kind of afford you, though. You can open up Outlook, for example, or open up Microsoft Teams, and it'll just grab that identity that you've already signed into Windows with, and it'll just sign you into those applications too. So that way, as a company, you're able to prevent people from having to continually type in their password on the same computer when we already know from an IT security perspective they probably are the authorized person who should be able to access that content from that machine. So, there's further methods we can get, like biometrics or a complex PIN number that's device specific that can be worked. So even if someone phishes your password, it's irrelevant. They can't get into that device itself with a phish password, even if they had it. So, We'll talk more about that. So let's go. So common scenarios and recommendations. So here's some common hybrid identity and access management scenarios with recommendations as to which hybrid identity option or options might be appropriate for each. So if you need to sync a new user, contact, and a group account created in my on-prem directory to my cloud automatically, any of these solutions will do that. All these solutions will synchronize users, contacts, and groups from on-prem to Azure AD, right? So that's not a distinction. All these solutions will allow you to set up your tenant for Microsoft 365 hybrid scenarios. All of these solutions will enable users to sign in and access cloud services just using their on-prem password, right? All of these solutions allow you to implement single sign-on using corporate credentials, so that's good. Now, all of these will allow you cloud-based multi-factor authentication solutions. So you can do cloud-based multi-factor with like Microsoft Authenticator, or even like SMS text messages. That's also allowed from Azure AD. Also, emails sent to you, that's allowed from Azure AD. Now, let's get into this distinctions, because there's 3 things that are unique to specific patterns here. So if you need to ensure no password hashes are stored in the cloud, because some companies, maybe they're in healthcare or finance or government, something highly regulated, in those situations, they might have some security or compliance policy that says, hey, no passwords or password hashes can be stored in the cloud. They have to be on our infrastructure that we're personally responsible for maintaining. If that is the case, you cannot use password hash sync, right? Because password hash sync is syncing a encrypted hash of your password to Microsoft's cloud. Not the password itself, but a hash of that password. Now, if you use pass-through authentication, what you're doing is you're authenticating on-prem and letting that pass through, right? If you're using ADFS, that means Active Directory Federation Services, you have a server on your on-prem that's handling the authentication, and it doesn't have to store that password hash sync in the cloud. So please understand that distinction, right? If you need to enable on-premise multi-factor authentication solutions, you have to be able to use on-prem multi-factor authentication solutions. You have to use ADFS for that. And there's been a lot of old legacy systems that were used for maybe like a FIDO2 token, just like a banker's token. It's basically a keychain. It has a rolling password on it that's tied in with some other system, and that system's typically in your on-prem. In that instance, ADFS is what's connecting this third-party system to authenticate you in the cloud identity, right? ADFS is handling that handshake because it's a highly configurable tool, right? But a lot of the solutions that people were using ADFS for, there's better solutions in the cloud now. And you'll also use ADFS if you need to use smart card authentication for users. So smart cards are very similar to what I just described, like the banker's tokens, but instead of having like something with something you have, the smart card, you literally just plug it in to your laptop and it acts as something you have, right? So in like 2002 Department of Defense contractor or something, you might use a smart card to be able to access the system, and you're expected to keep that smart card on your person. So if you're going to go get coffee or a snack from the vending machine, you have to take that smart card with you, is the typical like operational security best practice there. So again, the only distinctions we should really be memorizing here for this exam is that if you need to make sure no password hash is stored in the cloud, you can't use password hash sync, but pass-through authentication, which uses on-prem solutions, and ADFS, which is an on-prem solution, you can use those without storing anything in the cloud, right? If you need to use an on-prem multi-factor authentication, you have to use ADFS. And if you're going to use Smart Card, which in my opinion is just another multi-factor authentication solution on-prem, you have to use ADFS. Okay. So carry on. I wanted to drill that in because this is on the exam. This understanding will be tested. It's one of the core competencies. So yeah. So password hash synchronization with single sign-on. Let's see. ADFS can be integrated with your enterprise private key infrastructure to allow sign-in using certificates. These certificates can be soft certificates deployed via trusted provisioning channels such as MDM or GPO smart card certification or certificates, including PIV and CIC cards or Hello for Business Cert Trust. Yeah. So, and I have seen a few companies now use certificates. I have seen that pattern before. So license requirements for using Azure AD Connect. So using Azure AD Connect is free, and it's included with your Azure subscription. Okay. There's no special license you have to get. If you're using Azure, period, you have Azure AD Connect. Okay. That's probably also possibly on the exam. Yeah. What a deal. So I hope that's been useful, just at least understanding hybrid identity and that, password hash sync is able to do pretty much everything except for keep things from being in the cloud credential-wise and allow you to use on-prem authentication. If you're going to use on-prem authentication, it has to be ADFS. And if you're trying to make sure that you're not using password hashes stored in the cloud, it can be pass-through authentication and it can be ADFS. So I wanted to get into these 3 different modes, though, just so you can see them, because this is relevant. So what is password hash synchronization with Azure AD? So password hash synchronization is one of the sign-in methods used to accomplish hybrid identity. Azure AD Connect synchronizes a hash of a user's password from an on-premises Active Directory instance to a cloud-based Azure AD instance. Password hash synchronization is an extension to the directory synchronization feature implemented by Azure AD Connect Sync. You can use this feature to sign in to Azure AD services like Microsoft 365. You sign into the service by using the same password you use to sign into your on-premise Active Directory instance. So that's what I was saying. Like with this whole setup, you'll make a password on-prem, and Azure AD Connect will allow you to use that same password for cloud resources. So you're not having to have I have a Gmail account and I have a Slack account. You can make it so that your one company email address and password, or your user principal name and password, that'll work on everything that's working with SSO. So pretty handy. And password hash synchronization helps by reducing the number of passwords your users need to maintain to just one. Password hash synchronization can improve the productivity of your users and reduce help desk costs because no one wants to type their password in constantly. It sucks. Password hash sync also enables leaked credential detection for your hybrid accounts. Microsoft works alongside dark web researchers and law enforcement agencies to find publicly available username password pairs. If any of these pairs match those of our users, the associated account is moved to high risk. So that's super cool. That's really, really useful because whenever credentials get dumped, there's like hundreds of thousands of credentials that just get dumped to these databases. And when that happens, this allows an automation inside of Azure AD to just flag the user as high risk and say, dude, you got to change your password. And you can make policies to just force people to change their password if it's detected on the dark web, which that's really handy too. You can make sure that people just don't get pwned or properly owned. That's a IT security term for having your account get hacked and somebody else has ownership over your account. So only newly credentials found after you enable password hash sync will be processed against your tenant. So verifying against previously found credential pairs is not performed. So if you're going to turn on password hash sync, I recommend in that same time, you just make it so everyone has to change their passwords if you don't already have a very, regular password change time frame. You just want to make sure this does protect you properly because getting hacked sucks. Optionally, you can set up password hash synchronization as a backup if you decide to use Federation with Active Directory Federation services as your sign-in method. So keep this in mind. I saw this on the exam. This was on the exam. So when you set up password hash sync, you can have it be a backup. So if you're using ADFS will be the preferred, but it can kind of cover you if your ADFS server goes down, has some sort of an outage. You can make it so people can still sign into stuff. Your company's not just dead in the water. And password hash sync acts as a backup. But password hash sync will not be the default. It'll only be the failover. So that's kind of handy. So in order to do that, you need to install Azure AD Connect. You have to configure directory synchronization between your on-prem Active Directory instance and your Azure Active Directory instance. So there's a wizard that you'll go through. So you'll install Azure AD Connect. You'll open the application. It'll walk you through one of those next option windows, and you'll be able to pick directory synchronization. And in that, you'll be able to enable password hash synchronization. Even if you're in an ADFS setup, you can still set that up as a backup. So super handy. And then pass-through authentication. These are things that I saw on the MS-100, but the MS-500 is the first exam, and then you'll get an MCSA. Once you have the Microsoft Solutions Associate certification, you'll be able to pass the MS-100 and the MS-101. So the MS-100, I did see this on, and I'm guessing it's covered just as much in the 500, which is the prerequisite for the 100. So users sign in with Azure Active Directory pass-through authentication. What is Azure Active Directory pass-through authentication? Azure Active Directory pass-through authentication allows your users to sign in to both on-prem and cloud-based applications using the same passwords. This feature provides your users a better experience, one less password to remember, and reduces IT help desk costs because your users are less likely to forget how to sign in. When users sign in using Azure AD, this feature validates users' passwords directly against your on-prem Active Directory. So yeah, it'll validate them directly against your on-prem. This feature is an alternative to Azure AD password hash synchronization, which provides the same benefit of cloud authentication to organizations. However, certain organizations wanting to enforce their on-premises Active Directory security and password policies can choose to use pass-through authentication instead. Review this guide for a comparison of various Azure AD sign-in methods and how to choose the right sign-in method for your organization. So from what I've seen in the industry, people only use only use pass-through authentication if they have to. It's only if legal and compliance and security, one of those teams typically, has some policy that's like, we have to make sure we only authenticate and store credentials on-prem. If that's a requirement, then pass-through authentication is kind of what you're stuck with. But I've just seen general guidance say only do pass-through authentication if you have to, because it has some shortcomings, right? So in this instance, the user would try to sign in to Azure AD, and pass-through authentication would basically redirect your sign-in portal over to on-prem via this pass-through authentication agent. And the experience be like, you go to sign into like Office 365, you type in your email address, and you go to type in your password, and before you can even type your password, a window pops up, which is this pass-through authentication agent, and it will redirect you, to basically enter that password in the agent, and that'll kick it over to Active Directory on your Windows server. It'll say, hey, is this the right password? If it says, yeah, that's the right password, then identity synchronization using Azure AD Connect will give it the okie doke, and you'll be able to sign in. So that's kind of the system. Now, from an architectural perspective, you can see a few things that can go wrong, and the implication is that people can't sign in if any one of these links in the chain break. Like if you have this pass-through authentication agent stop responding, or the server gets a virus, or there's all kinds of things that could happen, then this won't pass it to your AD. If any issue with your AD server happens, then it breaks the chain as well. And then also, if Azure AD Connect has any issues, then that can break as well. So the implication is that every user in your entire environment may not be able to sign in until you get that system back up. So that's why I've seen a lot of people say don't prefer this method. It's better to go with something that's a little bit more robust than pass-through authentication. So, but if your hands are tied, then just do right by having backup servers and antivirus and snapshots so you can revert back, things like that. But I digress. You can combine pass-through authentication with seamless single sign-on. This way, when your users are accessing applications on their corporate machines inside your corporate network, they don't need to type in their passwords to sign in. Key benefit of using Azure AD pass-through authentication is a great user experience. That's true. Users use the same password to sign into both on-premise and cloud applications. Users spend less time talking to IT help desk resolving password-related issues. Users can complete self-service password management tasks in the cloud, so you can change your password, right? If it's permitted. And it's easy to deploy and administer. It's true. There's no need for complex on-prem deployments or network configurations. You need just a lightweight agent to be installed on-prem. It's true. And no management overhead. The agent automatically receives improvements and bug fixes. So that is a benefit. The agent will patch itself, so you don't have to focus on like, oh, hey, there's an update. I need to get this installed. It's secure. On-premise passwords are never stored in the cloud in any form, and this is really the reason you'd use this. You'd use pass-through authentication if you're just like, yeah, we'll get slapped on the wrist if we store passwords or password hashes in the cloud for compliance reasons. This protects your user accounts by working seamlessly with Azure AD conditional access policies, including multi-factor authentication, blocking legacy authentication, and by filtering out brute force password attacks. So that's dope. That really is cool. That even if like you have these on-prem heavy requirements, you do still get the benefit of the highly configurable Azure AD conditional access policies. You can make sure that people are signing in only from whatever specific conditions you require. And you can basically say, hey, if these things happen, let's say it's a managed device and they're using this specific browser, then give them a full experience. But if they're on an unmanaged device, maybe give them browser-only experience and don't allow them to download things. That way, you don't have any potential for exfiltration of data in mass, right? So that's pretty freaking cool. The agent only makes outbound connections from within your network. Therefore, there is no requirement to install the agent in a perimeter network, or also known as a DMZ, which is a demilitarized zone. So it's basically you have your internal company, and then you can have a DMZ, and then you have like the public internet. The DMZ is a place internal and external can talk, right? And usually there's really tight like firewall requirements on what is allowed to be there, but you don't even have to go through that because everything's on-prem. So the communication between an agent and Azure AD is secured using certificate-based authentication. These certificates are automatically renewed every few months by Azure AD. So that's kind of cool. And it's also highly available. Additional agents can be installed on multiple on-prem servers to provide high availability of sign-in requests. So that answers, one of the negatives that I said earlier, that if the service stops responding, it goes down, but this allows you to have that agent installed on multiple machines, possibly in multiple geographies. So that way, it's just highly available. If one of them stops responding, it'll just find another one in your internal environment. So super handy. So feature highlights. Supports user sign-in to all web browser-based applications and into Microsoft Office client applications that use modern authentication. Sign-in usernames can be either on-premise default usernames or your user principal name, or another attribute configured in Azure AD known as an alternate ID. So that's actually pretty handy. I've seen this happen with a lot of companies where maybe they have like an employee ID or something as like the user principal name, but maybe people want to sign in as like first name dot last name or something like that. This allows you to configure whatever the company asks you to. So that's cool. The feature works seamlessly with conditional access features such as multi-factor authentication to help secure your users. Integrated with cloud-based self-service password management, including password write-back to on-prem Active Directory and password protection by banning commonly used passwords. So, Spring 2023 is not going to be an allowed password. You can put that on, the common banned passwords, or, some football team in the year. Common passwords a lot of people try to pick. You can just straight up ban them. And I do want you to memorize this piece because this is probably on the exam as well. Pass-through authentication does support password write-back to on-prem Active Directory and password protection by banning commonly used passwords. So write-back is a big deal. A lot of companies don't allow write-back because there's oftentimes a lot of companies have like the idea that Active Directory on-prem is the single source of truth, and they like the idea of their IT department controlling the physical infrastructure, the patches, the software backups, all of that. And if that's the single source of truth, they're fine with cloud applications reading the information and showing it, but what they don't want is a cloud application that writes back to the single source of truth, because the concern I've heard over the years is that if there is that write back, then maybe they lose their sovereignty. Some cloud company could have a server get hacked, and then their single source of truth gets thrown sideways. So I have seen companies not want password write back, but I also see a lot of companies who do want password write back. The reason you'd want password write back, meaning people from cloud can change their password and it'll change their password on-prem, you can allow for users to self-service password reset. So you'd have the users enroll in multi-factor authentication, so they'd have like maybe an SMS text message or their personal email to get a one-time password, and maybe they have like the Microsoft Authenticator application on their phone that has a little pop-up and does number matching or something, right? So as long as you can prove something and something you have, then you have multi-factor authentication, and you can say, hey, I believe you're the real user, you're the real Slim Shady, you can change your password, right? So that prevents a lot of IT calls if end users can reset their own passwords. I know a lot of companies who have like a help desk that's the main thing they do. Like more than 50% of what they spend their day doing is talking with people and helping them reset their passwords or unlock their accounts. So if you can remove that barrier, increase security, make sure people are able to actually authenticate as who they are and change their password themselves, then people aren't annoyed that they have to sit on hold and then talk to someone on help desk to change their password and get back into the system. They can just self-serve and get along with their day. And then the other benefit is your help desk is able to focus on other things, which a lot of help desks have a huge queue backlog they're constantly trying to get ahead on. So this can really help lean out, a help desk. They can focus on more important tasks and improve their quality there. So multi-forest environments are supported if there are forest trusts between your AD forests and if name suffix routing is correctly configured. So if you're using pass-through authentication, then you're able to basically support these really complex environments. Now, I have seen in very large environments multi-forest. Typically, this happens when a company grows through acquisition and then maybe acquires some other companies that grew through acquisition. If that happens, you're probably going to find yourself in a multi-forest environment because there's so much in production that it doesn't make sense to migrate an Active Directory environment. It makes more sense just to tie them together. And so that's what multi-forest environments are for. And pass-through authentication does support multi-forest environments. So you can use this whole one identity single sign-on password write back even in a complex environment. So pretty cool. It is a feature free. My freaking brain. It is a free feature. You don't need any paid editions of Azure AD to use it. It can be enabled via Azure AD Connect, so it's already built into the Azure AD Connect you install. It uses a lightweight on-prem agent that listens for and responds to password validation requests. So it's lightweight. You can install it on pretty much any server. Not a lot of requirements. Installing multiple agents provides high availability of sign-in requests, so you end up being highly available. If one of them stops responding, your service doesn't break. You can just kind of monitor the health and go, oh, it's not working on this server over here, and you can service it without anyone screaming. It protects your on-prem accounts against brute force password attacks in the cloud. And so that's pretty common, honestly. Brute force password attacks is like people will have like a huge dictionary of just common passwords, and it'll just bang your account with a list of commonly used passwords. And sorry, Broncos 22 is not the right password, guys. So that's pass-through authentication. I hope that's understood now. So let's get into like ADFS federation, right? So what is federation with Azure AD? Federation is a collection of domains that have an established trust. The level of trust may vary, but typically includes authentication and almost always includes authorization. A typical federation might include a number of organizations that have established trust for shared access to a set of resources. You can federate your on-premise environment with Azure AD and use this federation for authentication and authorization. The sign-in method ensures that all user authentication occur on premises. This method allows administrators to implement more rigorous levels of access control. Federation with ADFS and Ping Federate is available. Yeah, so I don't know why these are so low res. Look how low res these are. It's so bad. But yeah, I'll do it here because it doesn't matter if it's on a bigger window. So you have on-premise Active Directory. Here's where it starts. So you have the internet, this dude's laptop. You try to sign in, and it's gonna go to on-prem Active Directory with ADFS. So that's that window I mentioned where like you try to sign in and it'll see you type like at company.com and be like, oh, company.com's ADFS. It'll pop a window up or redirect you to a window that as you enter your password there. And so I've had some people complain like I was typing my password and you just redirected me over here. It's like, yeah, that's ADFS. So if that happens, you type in your password, you hit enter, and what's going to happen is ADFS is able to check if that's the right password, and if it is, it'll allow you to access all of this content over here. It'll say, yeah, through a web application proxy, which is just a server that's in between your AD on-prem and any other cloud service. All it does is basically give you a hook that you can tie an external application into Azure AD so you can authenticate that way. This is also, by the way, a lot of companies may have a lot of legacy applications that are on-prem, and they're like, hey, sometimes they're homebrew, sometimes they just acquired them. And it's like, hey, how do I use like Azure AD conditional access policies on this like on-prem application? Well, you can. To do that, though, you have to set up a web application proxy. And with that web application proxy, you're able to basically let Azure AD talk to this application. And so Azure AD can broker who can and can't access that. So that's pretty cool. And then, if you're in the extranet, so outside of the network, you're able to also go directly through that web application proxy to ADFS on-prem AD. And it says, John at company2.com is in the system and has the rights to access this application. So sure. And so the Federation Trust will give them access to whatever those applications might be. So I hope that's clear. If it's not, then read it yourself. It's here. I'm trying though. So you can see why some people have ADFS, especially like I said, if they're an older company, they have a lot of legacy applications. That's really why you would use ADFS. It's because with these web application proxies, you're trying to tie on-prem applications into these cloud identities so that you can actually have people type in their email address and password and access whatever they need to, and just trust that you've configured your access controls correctly. So pretty cool. So we're back to the original, what is hybrid identity question. So just recap real quick. Password hash synchronization is when you have your on-prem password get a cryptographic hash that's stored in Azure AD, so it's able to be referenced, but it doesn't store your raw password there. And so that's the most secure method that allows you to get notified if any dark web leaks happen of your passwords, and you can flag users as high risk, right? Pass-through authentication lets you make sure that credentials are only ever stored in your on-premises, as where ADFS allows for password hash sync as a backup, right? And so ADFS says, hey, most of the time we want you to handle on-prem, but if it fails, make sure people can still access what they need to. And the reason you would have ADFS is because you have a lot of on-prem applications that you want to treat as enterprise applications or web applications as far as authentication concerns. So these authentication methods also provide single sign-on capabilities. Single sign-on automatically signs your users in when they are on their corporate devices connected to your corporate network. So common scenarios and recommendations. We already went through that, and licenses. So yeah, that's all we have for what is hybrid identity. I know we were repetitive with that. That was on purpose. That's so that you memorize this, because I don't want you to have to keep watching the same video over and over again. Repetition is the mother of learning. So keep that in mind, that when we repeat something multiple times, it's going to get caught in your mind, and you're going to memorize it. And when you're asked a question, you're able to recall that intimate understanding of what these tools are, and you're going to answer the question correctly, and you're going to get this exam, and you're going to get the job, and you're going to make a lot of money, and you're going to help a lot of people in your career. So we're going to keep going. There's going to be more episodes of this. This is the first of many, but I hope this has been helpful to you. Please leave a like, a comment, and subscribe. And I'll be sure to keep pumping these videos out, helping everybody get ahead in their careers and do awesome security work. So I'm the Data Lord. Until next time, study more.